much and welcome. Thank you for braving the cold. We're glad to have heat in here. We had a rehearsal one night where there wasn't. That was so anyway, I have to start off by apologizing, especially to Val in the audience somewhere. We don't have program. There are programs, but they are sitting over at Wales Coffee Shop right now. It is entirely my fault. I had a gig yesterday. I was playing out at Shepherd Hill, out in the center part of the state, and the last set went about an hour over, and I got back and Wales was closed, and we don't have programs. So I will be your program person today as we go through that. That first piece by, I want to make sure I get his initials right. All right, by F.W. Meacham. It's known as American Patrol, and I'm sure you've probably heard it. Some of you are very familiar with the Glenn Miller version of that, which is a wonderful swing piece. What we're doing, our theme for today's concert is we're going through the history of popular music in the U.S., starting in the early mid-1800s and moving up to contemporary times. And we're going to do this as best we can in order going through it. Our first piece we'll be doing is a tribute to Stephen Foster, an American, probably the most important popular music composer of the early and mid-1800s. He was born in 1826 and died in 1864, so he was only 38 years old, but was really prolific at that point. This piece was arranged by Sammy Nestico, who at that point, later on wrote for Count Basie, but he was an arranger for the Marine Band. So this was originally written for the United States Marine Band. You will hear Camptown Races, My Old Kentucky Home, Swanee River, Oh Susanna, and others that you will recognize. So we'll begin our journey through pop music with a tribute to Stephen Foster. So when you think about some of those pieces being written almost 200 years ago, how many of you recognize some of them? Yeah, that's a nice thing when that carries on like that. This next piece is not a tribute to a single composer, but it bridges our gap really nicely as we're going through history. There's one of our favorite arrangers for wind band is a gentleman named Warren Barker, and he writes so creatively with linking together tunes. And he did a whole series of pieces called Themes Like Old Times. And this one is centered between 1910 and 1919. So we're bridging that gap pretty nicely between Stephen Foster. This is a collection of popular songs. You'll hear Swanee, For Me and My Gal, Put Your Arms Around Me Honey, Pretty Baby, and The Tiger Rag. So we're in the World War I vicinity now when all this is going on. This is sort of the less patriotic but more uplifting hometown popular music. So this is Themes Like Old Times 2. He did 3 of them. Someone else did a 4th one. It's just no good at all. We can get rid of it. But the three that he did were magnificent. we're going to move now into the era of George Gershwin. He was born in 1898 and passed away in 1937. And it's hard to imagine someone having such a great impact on our culture and musical society in just that short period of time. He was known for pop music, classical music, jazz music, musical theater. He was in all areas. He and his brother Ira, who was a lyricist, musicals like American in Paris and other such things. There's so many wonderful things that come out of George Gershwin. So we've got a nice arrangement of his, simply called Gershwin, with an exclamation point. And we've got Fascinating Rhythm, Embraceable You, Somebody Loves Me, Somebody to Watch Over Me, and I Got Rhythm. I'm sure some recognizable rhythm. So this is Gershwin. And again, you've probably heard some of those. We're in the era now, we're going to move forward into to Glenn Miller. And this is a really wonderful, another work arrangement in the Miller mood. And you will hear, well, Glenn Miller had an interesting life too, also very short. He was born in 1904 and died in a rather mysterious plane crash in London in 1944. He was over there with the Air Force and he was trying to get from London to France to do a concert. And the plane went down, it was never found. He had boarded the plane at the last minute. Nobody knew he was on there. It took about 2 weeks to even determine that he was not around anymore. But he left us certainly a legacy with his big band of great dancing music, most of it right in the World War II vicinity. So what you're going to hear today is In the Mood, probably the most popular one, Moonlight Serenade, I've Got a Gal in Kalamazoo, Serenade in Blue, Little Brown Jug, and we will close quietly with At Last. So this is In the Miller Mood. big concert we've got coming out on April 19th. Some of you are from the area and know that April 19th is a reasonably significant date. And that will be the 250th celebration all day here in town, starting at about 4:45 in the morning, going all day with parades and ceremonies and all sorts of things until our final concert in the evening at Cary Hall at 7 o'clock. I do want to let you know admission is free. There will likely be, and I'm not sure we'll let people know, but there will likely be call ahead reservations or tickets because they're expecting a big crowd in town that day. But we have some exciting things on that program. We've got 2 pieces that we've commissioned. One was back from 2013 for LexMedia's 300th, which is perfect to do again, by Mr. Daniel Lutz, called Seeds of Revolution. And it's a wonderful, wonderful piece that he has yet to get published 12 or 13 years later. He's looking to do it for next year. And he will be conducting that piece on the night. So to have a piece, conducted by the composer is something that's really special. We also have a world premiere going on that night called Symphony Number 11, the year 1775, by Dr. Andrew Boysen from the University of New Hampshire, who is a prolific composer for shows, who has recorded so much great wind band music. And again, he'll be down to conduct his own piece and be working with us along the way. Along with that, a lot of other favorites of American music, early American music, as we celebrate the 250th, which is also our 50th year. The Bicentennial Band was founded in '75 by Don Gillespie for performance then. So we hope you're able to make that concert as well. It will be on Saturday, April 19th at 7 o'clock in Cary Hall, and admission is free. Tell your friends, we'd love to see the place filled up. We're going to take a short break, let the trumpet players wear out, chops wear out a little bit, and then we're we can go rehab for a little bit, and then we'll be right back. So thank you so much. We're going to open the set with World War II era, but this composer, unlike the folks we had before, as with 38 years and 40 years and so on, lived to 101. That's Irving Berlin. Irving Berlin was born in Russia, as you may or may not know, immigrated here, and he was a super patriot in the U.S. So proud of his existence here. All the work and the writing he did over the years were really supportive of that. He was born in Russia. He won a Grammy Award, an Oscar, a Tony Award, and he won the Presidential Medal of Freedom, was given him by Gerald Ford. So, valuable person. You will recognize this. A lot of these pieces. Again, he was born in 1888 and passed away in 1989. So we will hear some of the rah-rah tunes of World War II. This is the Army, Mr. Jones, give me your tired, your poor. This is a great country, and God bless America. on to another really important composer as we get into the 20th century. The gentleman was born in 1924, passed away at 70 in 1994. This gentleman was an arranger, pianist, and a flutist. I don't know if you knew that or not. Has 4 Oscar awards, 20 Grammys, and was one of the most prolific writers for movies and theater and things like that. Of course, we're talking about Henry Mancini. This is his 100th anniversary. The Mancini Institute, which is located in Florida at the Frost School of Music, is doing a year-long tribute to him. There's so many great concerts, and if you look up the University of Miami online, you can find them because they stream them, and they leave them on YouTube for periods of time, and they're wonderful. So it's just something to think about as we're looking forward. We're going to hear some of his popular movie themes from over the years. We're going to hear Moon River, The Baby Elephant Walk, Charade, Deerheart, and Peter Gunn. So this is our tribute to Henry Mancini, called Mancini Spectacular. based on different things. It would not be complete without a nod to Leonard Bernstein. He's got so many credentials, I've got to make sure I have my notes together. As you may or may not know, he's from Lawrence, Massachusetts. He went to Boston Latin School and then to Harvard. He was the New York Philharmonic conductor at a young age, where he stepped in on a 2-hour notice to conduct the first concert he had. Composer, author, educator, humanitarian, first American conductor to win international fame. And he's from movies, from Broadway, from orchestral writings. His stuff is everywhere. We're going to do some things from, well, this is called a Bernstein tribute. So you'll hear from Symphonic Dances from West Side Story, a bit of the prologue, some of Somewhere, some of the Scherzo and the Mambo, and then we'll go to 3 episodes from the movie On the Town. You'll hear The Great Lover, Times Square 1944, and Lonely Town, and then we'll hear some excerpts from the Overture to Candide. So this is a Bernstein tribute arranged by Claire Grundman. This was also initially performed, and it was commissioned for the Marine Band in DC. All right. Now we've got some things from a couple of two American composers that are writing in tribute to things that have come before them. The first one is we're going to do by Grant Carrick, who is from Kentucky, actually, and he wrote this called Bayou Breakdown, and it's the take on it, the flavor of it is definitely, you know, Southern Central fiddle music, Appalachian fiddle music. But here's his intention. He says, Bayou Breakdown began as an attempt to write a fugue in the style of Johann Sebastian Bach. The main melody is introduced in a 4-part fugue and scored for the woodwinds. A brief transition into a folk-like lyrical theme based on a pentatonic scale. Simple enough. A brief transition takes the piece to its most dissonant section, evoking a poorly played waltz. Music of the people. The main melody attempts to reappear, but is swept away in a progression of descending chromatic chords. After a complete stop, the initial fugue returns, featuring soloists by the clarinet, bassoon, alto saxophone, oboe, trumpet, and tuba. After a few short trio statements of the main tune, the piece ends with a polyphonic flurry from the full band. So this is Appalachian music written in tribute to the writing of Johann Sebastian Bach. This is Bayou Breakdown. That's a fun piece. We're going to close with something even more contemporary. A piece by David Bicentennial. And it's a tribute to American jazz. Get to his notes page. The piece is called Melodious Funk. Some of you have probably heard of the great jazz pianist, Thelonious Monk. This is a takeoff on his name and his style. So I don't talk too long. I'll put it in Mr. Bicentennial's words, because his are better than mine. I don't normally like to begin program notes with dictionary definitions. It feels pretty stuffy to me. But it would have seemed appropriate for this piece, so here goes. Funk, pronounced funk. A noun and a verb. 1, an abrupt, flat, hollow sound. Example, the book landed on the floor with a thunk. Synonym, thud. Verb, to produce an abrupt, flat, hollow sound. And 3, the verb colloquial past tense and past participle of think. Nobody liked that one, okay. Melodious Funk was inspired by the famous jazz pianist Thelonious Monk. Monk's wife, Nellie Smith, nicknamed him Melodious Funk because of his clunky, awkward, and brilliant piano playing, and his somewhat scatterbrained and disoriented nature. None of you can probably identify with any of that. I know I can't. I really like the idea of playing around with Monk's first name because I personally really enjoy goofing around with spoonerisms, silly, ridiculous mix and match letter games, which often happen by accident. For example, slip of the tongue becomes tip of the slung. And second, because the nickname actually provided great musical inspiration. Melodious, well, that's fairly obvious. And funk, which is a great onomatopoeia, became the starting points for this piece. Big fat thunks are interdispersed with pointy, clunky, bluesy blips, which then transform into a long, smooth, laid-back melody accompanied by a funky bass line. I haven't consciously borrowed from any specific tunes or licks from Monk, although I do use small fragments of Dizzy Gillespie's song Salt Peanuts. But I hope you'll hear some similarities between this piece and Monk's iconic musical style and quirky attitude. So, Melodious Funk. special concert, and we hope some of you felt a little bit like dancing during that last number, because it's sort of, that's good. We got a couple of nods, that's good. Thank you so much. Please be safe driving home, and we'll hopefully see you again in April with a lot of friends. Good night.